Hello, and welcome back to the reading of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide by Carol Anderson. If you've been reading along, we are still working our way through chapter one. As you know, we are coming across some pretty heavy stuff, so taking the time to talk about what we come across and also allowing ourselves a little bit of time to reset with the information that we're receiving. If you're reading along with me, I am on page 30, still in chapter one. The chapter is Reconstructing Reconstruction. And we are on the second paragraph. Let's go ahead and get started. Congress overrode both his vetoes and hoped that there might be some way to work with the president. But in the spring and summer of 1866, the South's descent into an orgy of anti-Black violence signaled the final break between Johnson and the Republicans. In New Orleans, nearly 50 African Americans were slaughtered and more than 100 injured for meeting to discuss voting. This is just meeting to discuss voting. When one of the killers, who had just bludgeoned a black man to death, was warned that he might be punished, he scoffed. "Oh, hell, haven't you seen the papers?" He said, "Johnson is with us." In Memphis, there was another gory bloodbath and another round of silence from the White House. In Texas, from 1865 to 1868, nearly 1,000 African Americans were lynched. A woman pleaded with President Johnson to do something about the plight of the poor Negro. Their masters are so angry to lose them that they are trying to persecute them back into slavery. Their masters are so angry to lose them that they are trying to persecute them back into slavery. Justice Miller was livid with Southern leaders who sat in silence while the violence raged around them. "Show me," he demanded, "the first public address or meeting of Southern men in which the massacres of New Orleans or Memphis have been condemned." The single truth is undenied that not a rebel or a secessionist was hurt in either case, while from 30 to 50 Negroes and Union white men were shot down, which removed all doubt as to who did it and why it was done. As the black body count mounted, with justice nowhere to be found, least of all from the President of the United States, the Reconstruction era descended into nothing less than an age of violence and terror. Congress therefore moved to provide some level of protection, passing the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which divided the South into 5 military districts and tried to pit the U.S. troops between a still smoldering, vengeful rebel population and the freed people. Then, in response to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and organized terrorist violence, Congress issued the Enforcement Acts. It also passed, and the states subsequently ratified, the 14th and 15th Amendments, weaving citizenship for all those born in the United States, except Native Americans, as well as the right to vote into the Constitution. Johnson did everything in his power to stop constitutional recognition of Black people's citizenship and voting rights. The President of the United States did everything in his power to stop constitutional recognition of Black people's citizenship and voting rights, including convincing most of the Southern states not to ratify the 14th Amendment and launching a breathtaking and ultimately disastrous political campaign to unseat radical Republicans in Congress. Nevertheless, despite Johnson's wild fulminations about the Africanization of the South and the tyranny of Negro domination, the 14th Amendment was ratified on July 9, 1868, followed by the 15th on February 3, 1870. Congress had just created a legal structure to begin to atone for America's original sin. That was 1868 and 1870. The U.S. Supreme Court, however, stepped in and succeeded where Johnson had failed. There's that Supreme Court again. Frederick Douglass lamented that by the time the justices had finished, in most of the Southern states, the 14th and 15th Amendments are virtually nullified. The rights which they were intended to guarantee are denied and held in contempt. The citizenship granted in the 14th Amendment is practically a mockery, and the right to vote is literally stamped out in face of government. The Supreme Court justices gave the aura of being strict constitutionalists whose job was not to interpret or create, but merely to distinguish between the rights the federal government enforced and those controlled by the states. But the supposedly legal, neutral interpretations had profound effects. And the court, just like Johnson, demonstrated an uncanny ability to ignore inconsistencies and to twist rules, beliefs, and values to undermine the solid progress in Black people's rights that the radical Republicans had finally managed to put in place. The court declared that the Reconstruction Amendments had illegally placed the full scope of civil rights, which had once been the domain of states, under federal authority. That usurpation of power was unconstitutional because it put state governments under Washington's control, disrupted the distribution of power in the federal system, and radically altered the framework of American government. The justices consistently held to this supposedly strict reading of the Constitution when it came to African Americans' rights. Yet this same court threw tradition and strict reading out the window in the Santa Clara decision. California had changed its taxation laws to no longer allow corporations to deduct debt from the amount owed to the state or municipalities. The change applied only to businesses. People, under the new law, were not affected. The Southern Pacific Railroad refused to pay its new tax bill, arguing that its rights under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment had been violated. In hearing the case, the court became innovative and creative as it transformed corporations into people who could not have their 14th Amendment rights trampled on by local communities. So while businesses were shielded, Black Americans were most emphatically not. Businesses over people, another way to show the dehumanization of Black people. The ruling that began this long, disastrous legal retreat from a rights-based society was the 1873 slaughterhouse cases. New Orleans had passed a law not only to confine butcher shops, which their blood entrails an inevitable disease, to a discrete section of town, but also to allow only city-authorized stores to operate. The butchers went to court pleading that their right to due process under the 14th Amendment had been violated. The justices ruled that that was impossible because the amendment covered only federal citizenship rights, such as habeas corpus and the right to peaceful assembly. Everything else came under the domain of the states. As a result, citizens still had to seek protection for most of their civil rights from state governments and state courts. Even the right to vote, despite the 15th Amendment, was not federally protected. In Minor versus Happersett in 1874, Chief Justice Morrison R. Waite wrote, "The Constitution of the United States does not confer the right of suffrage upon anyone, because the vote was not coexistent with citizenship." This was reaffirmed in United States versus Reese, 1875. In Lexington, Kentucky, a Black man, William Garner, had tried to vote. The registrars Hiram Reese and Matthew Foshee refused to hand Garner a ballot because he had not paid a poll tax. Yet the Black man had an affidavit that the tax collector had refused to accept his payment. The registrars scoffed. With one wing of local government demanding proof of payment and the other flat out refusing to accept the funds, Garner knew his right to vote had been violated. The U.S. Supreme Court, in an 8-1 decision, disagreed. So they were told they had to pay a poll tax, but then the poll tax was not accepted. So the man was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Voter suppression. We still see it today with requiring IDs or trying to remove ballots, any number of reasons, but literally followed the instructions and was still met with goalposts being moved to ensure that this man could not vote. In another opinion, Waite wrote that the 15th Amendment did not guarantee the right to vote, but had merely prevented the states from giving preference to one citizen over another on account of race, color, etc. To emphasize the point, Waite reiterated, "The right to vote comes from the states." In quick succession, the court had undermined citizenship, due process, and the right to vote. The Supreme Court has way too much power. Next was the basic right to life. In 1873, Southern Democrats, angered that African Americans had voted in a Republican government in Colfax, Louisiana, threatened to overturn the results of the recent election and install a white supremacist regime. Threatened to overturn the results. Does that sound familiar? Blacks were determined to defend their citizenship rights and occupied the symbol of democracy in Colfax, the courthouse, to ensure that the duly elected representatives, most of whom were white, could take office. That act of democratic courage resulted in an unprecedented bloodbath, even for Reconstruction. Depending on the casualty estimate, between 105 and 280 African Americans were slaughtered. Their killers were then charged with violating the Enforcement Act of 1870, which Congress had passed to stop the Klan's terrorism. Chief Justice Waite in United States versus Cruikshank in 1876 ruled that the Enforcement Act violated states' rights. Moreover, the only recourse the federal government could take was the 14th Amendment, but, he continued, that did not cover vigilantes or private acts of terror, but rather covered only those acts of violence carried out by the states. The ruling not only let mass murderers go free, it effectively removed the ability of the federal government to rein in anti-Black domestic terrorism moving forward. But the rollback of rights was not over yet. Next on the list were dignity, and equality. In the civil rights cases, 1883, the justices ruled that the 1875 Force Act that banned discrimination in public accommodations was also unconstitutional because the 14th Amendment could be enforced only by the states, not federal government. In the civil rights cases in 1883, the justices ruled that the 1875 Force Act that banned discrimination in public accommodations, meaning those signs that said no blacks allowed, that was unconstitutional. Moreover, in a wicked 1-2 punch, the justices added that the 13th Amendment's ban on badges of servitude did not extend to discrimination in public accommodations, such as in hotels, restaurants, and rail cars. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley was exasperated with African Americans consistently seeking legal redress and laws to fend off the violence. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Bradley was exasperated with African Americans consistently seeking legal redress and laws to fend off the violence. This man was exasperated with African Americans asking, hey, stop us from being beat and killed. State-sponsored discrimination, legalized terror, and the reimposition of crypto slavery and another world of rightlessness that had come to define their lives after the Civil War. He barked that there must be some stage in the progress of his elevation when he takes the rank of a mere citizen and ceases to be the special favorite of the laws. Like Andrew Johnson, Bradley saw equal treatment for Black people as favoritism. Again, there's a cognitive dissonance. Equal treatment of Black people after being treated as less than human and still officially being treated as less than human, they considered that favoritism. The humanizing of Black people is favoritism. Unequal treatment, however, became the law of the land. In Hall versus DeCure, 1877, the justices ruled that a state could not prohibit racial segregation. Then, in a series of decisions, Strouder versus West Virginia in 1880, Ex parte Virginia in 1880, and Virginia versus Reeves in 1880, the U.S. Supreme Court provided clear guidelines to the states on how to systemically and constitutionally exclude African Americans from juries in favor of white jurors. The crowning glory was Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. Homer Plessy, a Black man who looked white, thought his challenge to a Louisiana law that forced him to ride in the Jim Crow rail car instead of the one designated for whites would put an end to this legal descent into Black subjugation. He was wrong. The justices, in an 8-1 decision, dismissed the claims that Plessy's 14th Amendment rights to equal protection under the law were violated. Justice Henry Brown unequivocally stated, if one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them on the same plane. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them on the same plane. Here, this is how you know that everything and any law that was written in favor of white people, because the race that they're considering inferior to another socially is African Americans, but the reason why they're inferior socially is because white people consider them inferior. So white people's feelings created a law. This is why people feel like feelings are facts, because at one point, people's feelings could turn into a law, it could become the law. And when Plessy argued that segregation violated the 13th Amendment's ban against badges of servitude, the Supreme Court shot down that argument as well, noting, "We consider the underlying fallacy of Plessy's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with the badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it." The gaslighting, the gaslighting there. Despite more than a generation of irrefutable evidence of widespread racial discrimination in the aftermath of the Civil War, the court created the mythic separate but equal doctrine to confirm racial segregation as the law of the land. The court then followed up with a ruling in Cumming versus Richard County Board of Education in 1899 that even ignored Plessy's separate but equal doctrine by declaring that financial exigency made it perfectly acceptable to shut down black schools while continuing to operate educational facilities for white children. Just prior to that, the court had sanctioned closing off the ballot box. In a unanimous 9-0 decision in Williams versus Mississippi in 1898, the justices approved the use of the poll tax, which requires citizens to pay a fee under a set of very arcane and complicated rules to vote. Although the discriminatory intent of the requirement was well known prior to the justices' ruling, the highest court in the land sanctioned this formidable barrier to the ballot box. In fact, Justice Joseph McKenna quoted extensively from the Mississippi Supreme Court's candid admission that the state convention, restrained by the federal constitution from discriminating against the Negro race, opted instead to find a method that discriminates against its African Americans' characteristics, namely poverty, illiteracy, and more poverty. The repercussions were harrowing for American democracy. The poll tax not only ensnared black voters, but also trapped poor whites. As late as 1942, for instance, only 3% of the voting age population cast a ballot in 7 poll tax states. Just 3% of electorate in these states decided who would sit in the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives to shape federal policy. This in turn strengthened the years of seniority and thus the stranglehold of federal law of these officials, who accordingly rose in the ranks to assume or hold on to key leadership positions, such as chairing the Foreign Relations Committee, Judiciary Committees, and others. Senator Walt George, a Democrat from Georgia, was proud of how states like his beloved Georgia were able to legally disenfranchise millions of voters. Proud. "Why apologize or evade?" he asked. "We have been very careful to obey the letter of the federal Constitution, but we've been very diligent in violating the spirit of such amendments and such statutes as would have a Negro to believe himself the equal of a white man." From 1873, with the slaughterhouse cases, Crinkshank, Plessy, Williams, and others, the U.S. Supreme Court had systemically dismantled the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and rendered the Enforcement and Force Acts dead on arrival. For strict constructionists, the court willfully ignored congressional intent and the history behind the laws and amendments. At the onset of the 20th century in Giles versus Harris, 1903, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote that the federal courts had no power, either constitutional or practical, to remedy a statewide wrong, even if perpetrated by the state or its agents. The Supreme Court thus identified states as the ultimate defenders of rights, although Southern states had repeatedly proven themselves the ultimate violators of those rights. Through antiseptic, clinical, measured language, the learned jurist had entrusted the protection of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for African Americans to the very same states that bragged, "This is a white man's government," that yearned for the moment to regain control of the freedom, and then the niggers will catch hell, whose citizens fretted, "We showed our hand too soon," with the Black Codes, which allowed Mississippi and its brethren to criminalize, auction off, and whip Black people, and that were determined to get things back as close to slavery as possible. The result was not lost on African Americans. One Black man from Louisiana summed it up this way: the whole South, every state in the South, had gotten to the hands of the very men who held us as slaves. So while the United States may have won the Civil War and Blacks may have tasted freedoms, the white opposition that ruled from the White House and the Supreme Court all the way down through every state house in the South meant that real change was infinitesimal at best. To quote one historian's paraphrase of Frederick Maitland, the slave law of the South may have been dead, but it ruled us from the grave. That's the end of chapter 1. Chapter 1 is really a clear indicator of the fact that it has always been about the dislike of Black Americans. It has always been about the belief that Black Americans and African Americans are not human and therefore do not deserve human rights. It has always been about the gaslighting of African Americans and Black Americans, where they tell us that things will be fine, but then everything is done to prevent us from access to anything. They create laws that make it so that we can vote, but then move the goalposts to ensure that we actually can't vote. Everything that was done during this time, and forward, but everything that was done during this time was a clear indicator of how this country feels about African Americans, the same people that they stole to bring over here to essentially build this country. Just hatred through and through. Chapter 1 was heavy. Chapter 1 was heavy. Thank you for going through it with me. We will pick up on chapter 2 next week. Likely we'll be moving through it, piece by piece. Take some time with this, sit with this and think about what was read. Think about how, again, reading this book, chapter 1 from the 1800s essentially, can be the same things that we discussed today. History is just continuing itself. I appreciate you being with me for this reading. I appreciate you going along with this journey with me. Again, give yourself a little bit of grace as you work through what comes up with this. Make sure that you're staying hydrated, and I will see y'all next week.